Welcome to McGuire on Wrestling.
What do you guys want to talk about?
Let's give the people what they want. Professional wrestling.
With Mike McGuire.
The happiest Canadian camper in the world.
Tell me when I'm telling lies.
Give me a hell yeah.
Welcome to what may be the most diverse episode of McGuire on Wrestling we've ever had here. And I say that in the list of characters we are going to have this week, because we are going to talk all about the biggest story in pro wrestling and outside of pro wrestling, one of the highest viewed series in Netflix right now, and that is the Mr. McMahon Docu-Series. Yeah, we're going to go there. I did a quick, very exhausted, very tired, 10-minute instant review on Wednesday after watching all 6 episodes, after doing a morning radio show, and it was like, oh, that was a lot. And it still is a lot, but there's a lot more going on in the world of pro wrestling than just that. We'll talk about that. Plus, this week, we're also going to give you a special guest in the form of famous wrestling fan JOHNNY REID. Plus, going back to that Mr. McMahon special, he joins us every week here on McGuire on Wrestling. Dave Meltzer, a huge part of that series, and we're going to get his direct thoughts on how not only he was presented, but how the entire special was presented. A lot of people have some very mixed feelings about the Mr. McMahon documentary, so we're going to get his side of the story, but we're also going to walk the other side of the fence here too. Bruce Pritchard, who was kind of a number one guy for Vince McMahon back in the day and still works with WWE today, had some very curt things to say and some very loyal things to say about Vince McMahon and maybe some not nice things about Dave. So we'll get Dave's thoughts on that as well. This isn't to stir up stuff either. This is a legitimate inquiry into things that were said on this special. So I think you're going to find this week's episode maybe a little more interesting than usual. And again, if you're here just because of the Mr. McMahon docuseries factor, I think you're going to get different feedback here than you do from the traditional wrestling podcast, because we are going to cast the net a little wider here and look at this from the perspective of a non-wrestling fan as well. And coming up in the next couple weeks here, we're actually going to talk to a couple of non-wrestling fans that have watched the Mr. McMahon series and get their feedback. But that's just one of the many stories to talk about this week in the world of pro wrestling. Really quickly, this is an absolutely free show brought to you by the team. We love doing it for you. We never ask you to pay for any of the content. People have offered it, though. So we do have a tipping option. If you'd like to support the show financially, you can head to McGuireShow.com, and there is a PayPal option to leave a tip, or you can email me directly to find out other ways. But that's not the point. Okay, it's appreciated, don't get me wrong, but it's not the point. The point is we love producing wrestling content for you. We've got 3 main core shows now. We've got this one, of course, that posts every Sunday and then airs Monday on CKXU-FM, and is supported by other radio stations across the country as well. We've also got the alternate commentary table that posts every Saturday, and that's just a fun look back at the week of wrestling. We're actually going to hear from those guys on today's show as well. Also, middle of the week now is the time where you're going to get Legends and Champions with Andy Evans, and that's a great show diving into the history of pro wrestling. And the neat thing about that show, Andy's over in the UK, so it's a bit of a different perspective on things that we may have grown up with in the wrestling world, but seeing it from literally the other side of the world. And Andy does a great job with that show every week. So hopefully you're subscribed to the podcast feed. That's what supports us the most. Just subscribing, following on YouTube, following on social media. The Team MoW, McGuire on Wrestling Facebook page, is wide open to everybody as long as you apply. And the application process is literally just to keep the bots out and keep the people that want to cause trouble out. It's a private group, but it's not really private. Once you get in, you're part of the family, you're part of the discussion, and you're going to meet a bunch of relatively rational wrestling fans, if that makes sense. But we talk about the business, we poke a little fun, we have some fun, and usually it's the hosts, including myself, busting each other's chops because we like to have fun with each other. But either way, we'd love to have you be on board for that. If you want to contact me directly about any facet of the show, you're always welcome to do that as well. I've got a very public email out there, McGuireShow@yahoo.com is where you can reach me, and you can also reach me on all the socials at McGuire Show. It's as simple as that. Coming up this week, yes, we dive all into the Mr. McMahon documentary on Netflix. Everybody's talking about it, but we also find out another wrestler is headed to Netflix or a theater near you. The main event has been set for AEW's WrestleDream, and could it be a big star's last match in that company? SummerSlam is getting bigger sooner. AEW loses a pay-per-view home, but gains several others. Dave Meltzer is here, plus famous wrestling fan Johnny Reid, your feedback on the Netflix series, and a lot more. Pitter patter, let's get at her. Some of the biggest stories of the week come together for the 5 count.
You want to hear the breaking news?
Now, there are some interesting headlines coming out of the Netflix documentary on Mr. McMahon. Probably one of the biggest ones we found out this week is that Vince McMahon himself wanted to buy the rights to the special after he put out a release saying the special is very one-sided and leaves out several key details about stories. Now, others believe this is a very accurate depiction of the Vince McMahon that they knew or believed existed. The bottom line in this, there's a lot covered in this series. While wrestling fans are seemingly more split, the series currently has a 71% rating on Rotten Tomatoes and a 7.8 out of 10 on IMDb. And you have to know that most of those numbers aren't just wrestling fans. So, very interesting feedback coming out of that. Now, McMahon has released his statements. Janelle Grant and her attorneys have issued some of hers. This is still far from over in the courts, but we'll talk more about the series coming up. Now, speaking of Netflix, wrestling, and movies in general, Deadline reported earlier this week that AEW's Maxwell Jacob Friedman, MJF, has been cast in the upcoming Adam Sandler comedy, Happy Gilmore 2.
Step right up, folks. See if you can outdrive the amazing golf ball whacker guy.
Now, MJF's last film role was in the biopic of the Von Erich family, The Iron Claw, though most of his scenes were ultimately cut from the movie. Now, there's no news as to what MJF's role is going to be in Happy Gilmore 2, but, you know, he wouldn't make a bad Shooter McGavin Jr. Yeah, just throwing that out there. The main event has been set for AEW's WrestleDream in Tacoma, Washington on October the 12th.
You want a shot at my AEW World Championship? You got it. Me and you at WrestleDream. And I'm going to kick your f***ing head in.
Woo, swear jar, Danielson. That's a fiver for sure. Bryan Danielson will face Jon Moxley for the AEW Championship. So far, that's the only match that has been announced, but that could obviously change this week with a loaded Dynamite. Big show, including the much-anticipated Will Ospreay versus Ricochet match for the AEW International Championship taking place this week. We knew that a 2-night SummerSlam was eventually in the cards for WWE, with 2026 and Minneapolis getting the event in lieu of WrestleMania. Well, it turns out the first SummerSlam doubleheader will actually take place a year earlier. This past week, WWE announced that MetLife Stadium, home to 2 previous WrestleManias, will now host 2 nights of SummerSlam on August 2nd and 3rd of 2025. Now, climate-wise, this makes a lot more sense than having WrestleMania in the spring. I was there for one of them. It was chilly. Nevertheless, there is no word yet if John Cena, who is retiring next year from in-ring performing, will be part of the show. But you gotta think, right? Like, yeah, all right. And while we wait for AEW to officially announce their broadcast and pay-per-view futures, Bleacher Report has announced that they will be removing pay-per-view content from their services. Now, in addition to AEW, Bleacher Report has serviced several sports on a pay-per-view model throughout the years. AEW pay-per-views were often purchased through Bleacher Report, and if you have any pending bundle pay-per-views ordered through them, your orders will be transferred to a different provider. You should be getting a notification about that. Sites like ppv.com, Triller, and YouTube pay-per-view are some of the replacement services, with the ongoing belief that AEW pay-per-views will be moving to Max possibly as soon as January of next year. And in other streaming news, here in Canada, Rogers Sportsnet Plus, which has been carrying the WWE Network content, including episodes of Raw, SmackDown, NXT, and all the PLEs, have stripped their library down considerably. That is in anticipation now of WWE's move to Netflix in the new year. Now, normally we would move right on with the show with Dave Meltzer from the Wrestling Observer. He is going to join us in just a bit. But for all the weeks that built up to its release, like I said earlier, the reviews are really mixed when it comes to the Mr. McMahon series. Joining me now as we're going to go through some of your feedback, it's my friend and Team MOW contributor, Joe Aguinaldo. How are you, Joe?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing great, pal. Doing great. Okay, you made it through the 6-hour marathon. We'll get to some of your thoughts on this in just a second, but an overall gloss opinion of the Mr. McMahon documentary series. Where are you sitting on this thing?
You know what? Like, you kind of hit it on the head. Like, as a longtime wrestling fan, it was good. It was entertaining. There were some, cool things to watch, but overall, it wasn't anything that I hadn't, read or heard over the last 30 years of being a wrestling fan. The one thing that really struck me, even though I've seen Vince on TV over the last 3 or 4 years, seeing him like sitting there talking for a prolonged period of time, it really hit me at how much he had aged. I don't know why this particular documentary hit me like that, but it did. And I guess it's because I've grown up watching him since the mid 80s and the 90s and the Mr. McMahon and the Attitude Era. And throughout all of those periods, he's always looked robust. I've seen him on the Muscle and Fitness magazines and, his workout stuff. But to see him sitting there, like it just really hit home at how much he had aged.
And I think part of that, too, is because he's being juxtapositioned against a lot of footage of himself from different ages and different years. And yeah, I mean, even the Vince McMahon in the 1990s and 1980s looks like a totally different guy. But I mean, let's face it, that's a longer time than we would like to admit, a lot of us, as we all get older here. But
yes, exactly.
I do want to get into the meat of matters here. And I do have some great feedback, and I want to see where you kind of stand on some of this stuff, and we'll chime in with our opinions here. But if you're listening to this and would like to offer your own thoughts as well, you're always welcome to. The Team MoW McGuire on Wrestling Facebook page is where you can do that. We'll get you in there. I'll start off with comments here from Bob Hunt, who is a part of our group. He says, 85 to 90% is not new. I don't need to hear about territories, WrestleMania, Monday Night Wars, Montreal Screwjob, steroids, and Owen. I've heard these and his defenses of those. I want to hear his view and culpability on what things like Tony Atlas brought up early in the documentary. We know what entertainment was in the Attitude Era on screen, but how does he defend the boys will be boys code of the road that made behind-the-scenes misogynistic, racial discrimination, and homophobia acceptable? He talked about values changing, but there were things that were as wrong back then, and they are today.
It's a good point, but I will also argue that statement with people who are still watching, and I didn't like a lot of this stuff back then, but you can't deny the fact that, people found it entertaining, right? And I'm not defending it. It's just, that was just the way it was.
I'd brought up a similar point to what you just said in my quick little 10-minute podcast that I did after watching the last episode. And Triple H has a line that kind of sadly rings true, which is like you said, who's worse, the ones doing it or the ones watching it and cheering it on?
And that is unfortunate. I will say, though, I guess with the benefit of hindsight, after watching, especially the stuff with the Attitude Era, part of me was like, wow, did I really watch that? You know what I mean? And I'll admit there was part of me that was like, looking back on it, that wasn't good. So I totally get what Bob is saying there.
Another thing, though, as a Canadian fan, we didn't watch a lot of it. There were times, if you remember back in the day when that era of Raw was mostly on TSN, and they would actually block out entire segments. They would actually keep things off the air. And I remember certain segments. That's why it ran either a half an hour or an hour later, because they would cut entire segments out of Raw that crossed the line of what they felt would get them kicked off the air, to be honest with you.
Yeah, and again, you're right, but we still did see quite a bit of it. So,
but I remember seeing some other things in that special that I know for a fact I did not see first run.
No, for sure,
and I never heard about. So
I do understand. Think about it. There's stuff, and as an older guy, there's stuff in the 70s that they did on TV that you could absolutely not do today. Stuff in the 80s, stuff in the 90s. So I do understand to a point the idea that values change. However, some of the stuff that they did back then, it doesn't matter what era it is. It wasn't good. Right. And Bob's point about how does, he would have liked to have seen Vince defend that. I think that's a valid point.
You brought up an interesting point on our Facebook group about Tony Atlas. And you said that he didn't look so good in this thing. I thought, if anything, good or not, he was probably the most honest one in this entire show.
When I wrote that was after, I want to say, the second episode.
Okay.
But as we went through it, 100% agree with you. I think he was the only one, or one of the only ones, that regardless of, people's sensitivities or whatever, he just said what he wanted to say. And he was, you know what, here was the comment that made it for me. Okay. Right at the end of, I think it was episode 6, or one of the episodes where they were like, what's Vince's legacy?
Yeah.
And guys like Cena are like, oh, that's a tough question. And Undertaker's like, I don't know. And these are like his loyal soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
Tony Atlas just came out and said what I think is true. Greatest promoter ever. You don't have to like him. You don't have to like what's happening with him now or some of the stuff that he's done, but you cannot deny what he's done for pro wrestling. And you know what? I'll even give a shout out to the ACT guys, Mitch and Dimitri, because they kind of said the same thing on their show, that regardless of what whether you like him or not, wrestling's where it is today. It's as popular as it is today because of Vince McMahon. So yeah, Tony Atlas, I thought, was probably the most honest out of everybody, which is kind of scary.
And I agree. But you know what? You bring up a great point. Let's go to a clip from yesterday's episode of the Alternate Commentary Table. This is our own Mitch Honsius and Dimitri Karolis talking about what Joe and I just said here.
What's interesting is that you'll watch it and be like, man, like, you're a piece of junk. But for Vince McMahon, he had built a reputation that sadistically everyone loved.
Yes.
His ruthless persona.
Wait until you get to episode 5, I believe.
Yeah.
They talk about this.
They do.
Yeah.
Oh, they do?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Oh, it's like the whole show.
Okay, because his ruthlessness, everyone knew it's like, Vince is all about business.
Yeah.
And we liked that. And Vince is ruthless. And we liked that.
That's right.
And then the character Vince McMahon appeared before as a result of Bret Hart.
Yes.
And we loved it even more in a disgusting way.
Are you sure you didn't watch episode 5 yet?
Buddy, I have no, I haven't.
Well, then, you know what? I'm telling you right now.
At episode 2.
You basically talk, without even knowing it, everything you just said is episode 5.
Okay,
yeah.
I'm only at episode 2.
Okay, well, wait until you get there.
That's my whole thing. And what's disgusting about the whole thing is we get to the tail end where what happened is so abhorrent.
Yes,
no one's on board with it.
Of course not.
Of course not. I'm not saying I am. But we cheered him every step of the way.
Yes.
Personally and professionally with this character.
Yes.
Vince McMahon.
There you go. Mitch and Dimitri from the Alternate Commentary Table posts every Saturday for free on the McGuire on Wrestling podcast feed. You can find it at McGuireShow.com. And Joe, like we were saying before that, it's really, really hard to find a moral compass when you go into how the sausage is made in any form of entertainment industry. It really is, because for the most part, you like to think that everything is noble and clean and crisp and fine and everybody just leaves feeling great. But we hear stories through the years and through the decades of people that maybe didn't have the best time putting on shows we love, maybe had very vile experiences putting on events and things that we've grown to love over the years here. I don't say that to excuse it, obviously, because I think everybody should have a good day when they go to work. But sadly, that's a lot of the reality of this thing, and I think it was just brought to the forefront in this Vince McMahon documentary.
Yeah, and you know what? Like, just to put some context around that, like, Vince, obviously, because of how big he is and who he is and what he's built, we're concentrating on him. But, if you look back in history to other wrestling promoters, this is not an uncommon story. Guys like Nick Goulas, for example, was brutal to work for. Guys like Bill Watts were like, again, if you believe the stories, there was kind of the same mentality. So, but
and there's people like Jim Ross that defend him till the day he dies,
100%. Right. So that's the thing. I think with McMahon, because of what he's built, because of how big WWE is and like everything that's happened, sure, we're concentrating on him, but you could, again, I can think of 3 or 4 old time territory promoters that you could put in that same chair, probably hear the same kind of stories.
And again, that doesn't make it right. We need to stress that. We're not condoning it by saying it. We're just not denying that it happens.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
That sometimes is even worse, I mean, I'm sure you've had rotten bosses. I've had rotten bosses. I've had moments of being a great person. I've had moments of probably not being the best person I could be. I won't say I'm anywhere near, the people we're talking about have done, but I mean, we all are perceived differently by different people, right?
Absolutely.
What separates perception from reality are the facts, though, and the way due process takes things through. And that's going to be what's going to be most interesting coming out of this thing with Vince McMahon, with the federal investigation going on, with the lawsuit going on. Something's going to come out here further than what we already know here. And it's starting to trickle out in the lawsuit, in the representatives all speaking. It's been very, very muddy once again. And I almost wish they had waited to do this thing until the lawsuit and everything else was settled, because then we would know more of the story. Then we would find out what's speculative versus what's reality. So another comment here on our Facebook page about the Vince McMahon docu-series. A couple here from Martin, actually, but I wanted to start with his first comment. He said, after watching the first episode, it didn't really make him want to hurry and watch the rest of them, since most of what he saw in the first episode is stuff that he already knew. And from what the reviews saw, it's pretty much the same thing throughout. Now, he did go on further to say after he'd finished watching the whole thing, he wasn't impressed by it. He said, like Bruce Pritchard said on the last episode, he feels like they could have done more to get the whole story of Vince instead of just trying to paint the story that Vince was a bad guy. But this goes back to the point that we were just talking about earlier. Again, if we know these things are going on, if we even believe these things are going on, who's worse, the people doing it or the ones that are supporting while it's going on? I think that you have to give fans a little bit of leeway, because fans often just care about the show, and that's what they should care about, is the show. And again, when you get into the weeds of any entertainment industry, it can get ugly. It can get gross. Other times, though, there are tons of great industries, tons of great acts out there. We're going to hear from a guy right away who puts on one of the best shows out there and is a consummate professional, consummate performer, and people love working for him, with our famous wrestling fan segment coming up. But it's really, really interesting to, again, see what fans who are hardcore, who know a lot of the history already, are saying versus those that don't. Because this show right now actually has a 71% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, which is pretty good, and a 7.8% rating on IMDb. And these are from, you would believe, more than just hardcore wrestling fans. And they're pretty high ratings for a show like this.
It has to be more than that, because like I would assume that wrestling fans make up a very small percentage of people that have Netflix. But I want to go back to Martin's point, actually, specifically about Bruce Pritchard. I thought like that Bruce's comment, you know, because we've always known him as, you know, quote unquote, the yes man for Vince McMahon, you know,
right,
whether you believe it or not. But I thought his comment was fair, because generally speaking, I didn't find that the documentary on the whole it tended toward the negative. That's how that was my first impression of the whole thing. And to have Bruce Pritchard come out and kind of give a human story about Vince, not that he's a ruthless businessman and he came in and he bought all the territories. No, man, he took care of my wife when my wife had cancer, saved her life. Mm-hmm. I wanted to hear more of that kind of stuff, because in other podcasts, for example, I've heard the same thing about Vince McMahon, like, you know, how he took care of Barry Windham when Barry Windham had a heart attack and a stroke on the same day, and how he paid for this guy's rehab or that person, you know, to get treatment for, you know, drugs or like addiction or whatever. Mm-hmm. I thought it would have been, I would have liked to, I guess, get more of a balance, because we didn't hear a lot of that stuff. We heard about how he's ruthless. He took over this, he bought his father out. He was this, you know, this big time businessman, which again, we've known about. And I'm not saying it's not fascinating, because I did find the very first episode really fascinating as someone who really enjoys the history of wrestling. But I would have liked to hear a bit more of a balance. And it was weird, because I kind of thought Dave Meltzer was probably the most positive on Vince, or one of the more positive, or maybe not positive, but let's say balanced.
I think Dave walked the line real well.
Yeah, I thought he was really good. You know, because everyone expected, you know, like, oh, you know, quote unquote, Uncle Dave is going to rag on Vince. It's like, no, I thought he was very honest when it came to Vince McMahon. And
that's the Dave we get here. In fact, coming up in just a few minutes, we've moved it back a little bit because I wanted to have this discussion first, because everybody's talking about the Mr. McMahon doc. But Dave Meltzer is on the show today. He's going to come up next, and we're going to talk to him about his feelings on how not only he was portrayed, but maybe how the entire thing was portrayed. Because, yes, Vince has done a lot of rotten things. He's even said it himself in the show. He said it himself. This is what I did. This is why. Okay? On the other side of the spectrum, we hear this all the time. And I'm not putting Vince McMahon in the same light as these, but how many times do you hear about these people who are like, the family guy, you know, the community guy, the guy that's out there and helping people out. You know, I truly believe that a good person and a bad person don't exist. I believe that people exist and they make good and bad choices, and whatever you choose more of, that ultimately weighs you as a person. But the question is, how much good versus how much bad outweighs the story of Vince McMahon?
Well, and let me throw some more into that. Like, we only know Vince McMahon, the wrestling promoter. We don't know Vince McMahon, the human. And quite honestly, this documentary didn't really give us much of Vince McMahon, the human. And I'm not saying that's a good or a bad thing, but we're only judging Vince on this one thing that you and I love to watch.
Yeah.
But we don't know the other side of that. And I think that's where maybe this documentary didn't serve Vince that well. Although, granted, he's also probably not the most open guy about his life, but I mean, you know what I mean?
Oh, I think he wanted to be. I think there were moments, especially like that first quote of his at the very beginning of episode 6, where he's talking about the computers of his brain. And when he brought up the third computer that I'm not going to bring up here because we are on the radio as well as on podcasts. But if you watched especially, you know what I'm talking about. You know, that's that guy that likes to try and say things that he or she are thinking about. And he's like, oh, if I just say it in a nonchalant way, maybe people think it's cool and normal. Right. And I don't think that was normal. I don't think, you know. No. So anyway, we're going to put a pin in this for now, though, because a lot of people are still watching the series. We'd love to hear your feedback. Again, the Team MoW, McGuire and Wrestling Facebook page. You can join there. If you want to send your private thoughts, you can email me directly, McGuireShow@yahoo.com. But Joe Aguinaldo helping us dissect a little bit of the Vince McMahon documentary here. Thank you very much, my friend. Anything else you want to say before we go on this?
I'm probably going to watch this again. I think my initial watch was I just needed to get my reactions out. But I think now that I've gone through it, I'd really, again, as a wrestling fan, so this is probably really geeky of me to say, I really want to now just pay attention to it. I think before I was just looking for, you know, my entertainment reaction to it, and I've gotten that out of the way.
Coming up next, a guy that, like we said, was heavily a part of this series, the one and only Dave Meltzer joins us for our weekly chat. You know we're going to talk all about this right here on McGuire on Wrestling. Thanks for being here.
If you're here, you're a part of Team MOW. Join us on Facebook at Team MOW McGuire on Wrestling and get in on the conversation. This is McGuire on Wrestling.
Hey, yo, how many of you here came to listen to your same generic wrestling podcast? Or how many of you came to listen to the alternate commentary table every single Saturday?
You're going to get our perspective of what the real fans of wrestling think, and no one does it like us.
Subscribe and stream to the McGuire on Wrestling podcast feed anywhere where you're streaming your podcasts. Survey says one more for the Greek guys.
Chair shot.
It's time for the Wrestling Observer Insider with Dave Meltzer, McGuire on Wrestling.
Before we get into the McMahon docu-series, I have a very important question that was asked by our Greek guys over on our other show, the Alternate Commentary Table, Dave, and it's specifically about you. Mitch himself, who considers himself quite a weightlifting enthusiast, and Dimitri, they're both in great shape. They were stunned by how good you look, so Mitch was dying to know, how much do you bench?
I have no idea. I probably haven't done a bench press in probably 26 to 30 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Do you remember what your last bench was?
I think the last time I tried to do a maximum bench would have been senior year of high school.
Holy Lord.
And I did 290 because we had a school meet and I was tied for second. But
see, one of the guys thought 250, the other guy thought 300. So I guess they're right in the wheelhouse there. So there you go.
That's when I was 17 years old, though.
So, you know what, 10 years ago? Anyway. All right, Dave, the biggest topic, obviously, to talk about. I mean, you were all over this thing. You and Mr. Shoemaker seem to be the two outside voices on this thing. Well, they had the lady that was the author as well of that wrestling book, but
Sharon Mazer,
yeah, and I thought she did a great job as well.
I did too. I thought she was interesting. Yeah.
And I never heard her before or seen her. I gotta find that book though, because I'm really interested in her perspective of the business. But yeah, the Mr. McMahon special is now aired on Netflix. Dave, you were a big part of it. A lot of people, and you and I talked about this beforehand. You had mentioned how they'd asked you a lot about the everything negative they could have and didn't hide away
and positive.
Well, and that's where I want to go on this, because a lot of people that are criticizing this special are saying that if anything, you actually added a weight of balance to this thing. A lot of your perspective was more neutral, and I'm wondering how much of the positive stuff do you feel got left out of this special?
Well, a lot more of the negative left out than the positive. I mean, I will say that.
Really?
Yeah, by far.
Okay.
I mean, you could have done 10 parts on the negative and just scratched the surface. Any story that was negative, they didn't have time.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? There's so many of them, you can't go into depth. I mean, how the Jimmy Snuka thing alone was an hour on Dark Side of the Ring and could have gone longer than that. So it's like, and they did it in what, a minute? It's like 40 plus years, 42 years of Vince running the company. And then you still got to deal with his childhood and everything. And the positive too. I mean, it's like you could probably do 10 parts on the positive too. It's just trying to fit everything in. I mean, the hilarious thing to me was, I didn't think that it was trying to be positive or negative as much as tell the story, but I think that the overlying story was in the company and everything. The guys are like, they come off like they're blind to the negative. You know what I mean? It's like like, look, the people who they wanted for obvious reasons to feature the most would be Hogan, Steve Austin, Rock, and John Cena. Mm-hmm. And they did feature Hogan. It was interesting. And the other ones, they were there, but they said nothing of note, which tells me that they must have said nothing of note. Because if they said anything of note, if Dwayne had said anything of note, Cena said anything of note, they'd have put it in there because, my God, that's who you want front and center. The Rock more than anybody.
Right.
So it's very clear that they, no matter what the situation was, I mean, they sure did not talk about anything in any depth that would have added to it, because if they did, they'd have been all over the thing.
Some of the critiques that wrestling fans have is that, well, a lot of this wasn't news to me, but this wasn't made specifically for wrestling fans. This was made for Netflix.
It was absolutely not made for wrestling fans.
Yeah.
I mean, it was made for the general public. And I think a lot of people go like, well, if they're not wrestling fans, they're not going to watch. And it's like, this was the second most watched thing on Netflix last week. And most of those people are not wrestling fans that were watching. Unfortunately for me, I can only judge it from someone who knows like so much about this subject. So it's not going to be the same perspective from someone who knows nothing about it. And that's what they were aiming for.
We're talking to Dave Meltzer from the Wrestling Observer and WrestlingObserver.com. He joins us every week here on McGuire on Wrestling, but you might be coming in because we're talking about his involvement specifically in the Mr. McMahon docu-series, which, as you said, one of the top viewed shows on Netflix this past week here, and probably will be as people are keeping up to it with the all 6 episodes. They're not like you and me sitting there binging through 6 episodes on Wednesday. How was that day for you?
Yeah, we actually I saw 4 of them on Tuesday, and so I think I only had the last 2 to go on Wednesday. So,
okay.
But yeah, and it's like those were hard days. I mean, it's like I don't have 6 free hours.
Yeah.
And I wanted to watch that Dump Matsumoto thing, which I've watched only 1 hour of so far.
Back to the Vince special here. One guy that brings you up in particular after watching some of the early episodes is Bruce Pritchard. And for those that don't know Bruce Pritchard, basically Vince McMahon's right-hand man for a number of years, especially in the creative department and when it came to production and things like that. Bruce still works with the company now. And Bruce made a point to actually kind of call you and David Shoemaker out a bit for some of your... What's that?
For telling the truth.
Well, and that might be the case. That might be the case here because he was not happy with you.
That's what he was mad about is, I mean, it's like I personally thought Bruce was okay early on, but then at the end it was kind of like, boy, did you get he got exposed once, but I mean, at the end, he got exposed bad. I mean, like, I don't think anyone thought Bruce came up well. And, calling out Shoemaker was very fair. And I know I was fair because I talked about everything. And calling them out really shows the insecurity that he has and the fear of the truth that Bruce has, which, Bruce does. Look, Bruce has great fear of the truth. If not, we'd be best friends because we both love wrestling.
Is that loyalty on his side, do you think that makes, and I want you to speak for him, obviously, but
of course it is. He's a Vince McMahon kiss ass. He's been since he was since he was like in his early 20s. That's just how it's been. And that's how he's been in and out. He's been fired and stuff, and then brought back a couple times, but that's just what he is. And look, I've known that since 80s. I knew Bruce before he was ever in WWF. So I know. Right. Bruce recruited me to work for WWF. That's just how it is.
To be fair, and what resonated with me was when he told the story about how Vince took care of the medical expenses for his wife during her cancer treatment. So, that can add a different level of loyalty from someone too, right?
Of course. He also fired Bruce a couple of times too. But the world isn't black and white. There's positives of Vince. Look, I get along with Vince at times too. You do both sides. If you only got one side, then you're hiding something bad.
When the lawsuit, if it does get reactivated here, because it's on pause right now from the federal investigation,
it'll be reactivated because you could just see this week they were the Janelle Grant side was sending out releases and things all week long. They were definitely jumping on this one.
Well, I was going to ask you, does this exacerbate things? Does this make things better for the prosecution, or is there anything?
No, I don't think this makes any difference at all. It's just good for publicity. It's like they used it for publicity for their case this week.
Right.
But as far as long term and everything like that, I guess maybe it puts more pressure on Vince to settle, because it's more negative publicity. But in the big picture, I don't think it makes a difference. No.
If you were to isolate some of the positives that may not have been mentioned in this, what would you fixate on, or what would you focus on that maybe they didn't cover in the special?
They talked about the growth,
right.
And that's the main positive. They talked about the growth. They talked about the size of the company. What other positives? You could talk about the charity work, which they didn't. But that's a positive. But of course there's the flip side of that too. Because they do it. You do it with cameras, and again, I don't want to knock anyone who does it, because people who are many kids love it whether there's cameras there or not. But it's there's charity and there's public relations, and believe me, John Cena, I can tell you, he does a lot of charity work, not public relations. But a lot of WWE is also, it's charity and public relations. And oftentimes, look, Vince told me himself. Vince was under the gun. I'm trying to remember, this would be early 90s, right? Vince is under the gun and started, really ramping up the public relations and the charity. And he bragged to me. It's like, we're going to do so much charity work now. You just watch. You know what I mean? But it was like because, the Donahue Show and things like that. It wasn't because they've been doing it all along.
We did hear that line back in the day from Stephanie as well, where philanthropy is tied to the next big marketing or whatever
Is this how you win in marketing? Yeah.
Yeah. And you know what? Whatever. I always say if you're going to give, you're going to give. And that's what ultimately matters in the long run here.
I know people. One of my very good friends is someone who has gotten a lot from a lot of people in wrestling. And I'll just say that there are many who absolutely do not want their names associated with him,
right.
or with that at all. There's so many selfless people in wrestling. Major, and John Cena being one of them. And there's others that their names are attached to it, and that's good too. And then there's others who flaunt it, which is another situation. Each one's different.
We're again talking to Dave Meltzer from the Wrestling Observer, WrestlingObserver.com. He joins us every week here on the show, but of course he's a big part of the Mr. McMahon Netflix Docu-Series, which is what we're talking about in this segment here. Dave, neither one of us are psychologists. We don't have, obviously, the academic backgrounds in this, but there was another interesting subject that came up in this, and that was talking about Vince McMahon's life itself and how perhaps, and again, this is only hypothetical, perhaps the alleged behavior could have been a result of a cycle of abuse as well. What do you think about that when you hear a statement like that?
People have been saying it all week. I think there's probably something to that. Yeah, I think it's, I mean, there's certain themes that you could tell throughout the documentary. I think one of the things with the documentary is that the people who put it together, Chris Smith in particular, I think when you watch it, I think that's the question he's trying to get you to ask and think about.
There was also a segment in episode 6, and I've talked about this. I did like a quick 10-minute pod after we just finished watching it because, I mean, I did the marathon 6 hours, so it was nuts. There was the one scene towards the end with Ashley Mazzaro in particular, and it was the fictionalized scene that aired on TV, but they were tying it to what could have been potentially considered as revenge creative, where if things didn't happen the way Vince wanted them to backstage, that somehow creatively that person might be punished or humiliated on air. Is that something you had heard of before all this?
I think we all, it wasn't, it's like, I don't know, that specific situation. But, look, I mean, do they take out reprisals in creative? I mean, of course, and the most famous one is when Steve Austin went on Bite This and not creative. The next thing for that next Monday, which ending up with him quitting the company, was him coming in on a Monday or, being told, hey, by the way, you're putting over Brock Lesnar. And it was just like, it made no booking sense at all. I mean, it was like, this is like a WrestleMania main event and you're putting on a Raw with no build. Like he was going to show up on Monday. It wasn't even advertised. And they were going to make the match during the show and he was going to lose. And it's like, I remember Austin just going like, I'm the one that you get to after you've beaten everybody. I'm not the first, right. Because he's the top star. And it was like obvious. And that's why he quit. And, he regrets quitting, but his reasons for being upset, those were valid, very valid reasons. I mean, they were mad at him and they were going to make him pay. And, Trish Stratus told a story about that too. She questioned something and then all of a sudden she's losing her championship or whatever, I mean, it's like, that's not unusual. I mean, they've done that since, that's been done for 40 years there. And that's not the only place. I don't want to act like, WWE is different from anywhere else. That happens everywhere.
And that's fair. And that may be a trend that changes here with the new regime. We'll see what happens as time goes by here, obviously. But I guess what was extra potent for me in that segment was the level of anger and intimidation and everything, even though it's a fictional segment, so to speak, between Vince and Ashley. I just thought the positioning of that, man, that hit a dark spot. You know what I mean?
The whole Ashley Mazzaro story is a dark spot.
Yeah.
I mean, a real dark spot. That's not one. It's funny because when that happened, when the story first broke, they were doing damage control and it just her story sounded so bizarre. But as time went on and we found out, from the doctor who she told, her story actually makes a lot more sense now than it did at the time. And it's a hideous story, not just what happened to her, but the reaction of what happened to her, like when she went and told about it and they said, don't ever say anything about it and tried to squash it. The whole story is really bad.
Yeah. Well, we'll spare you the details here if you would like to look it up yourself. Obviously, some discretion advised there. All right, Dave, your final thoughts here on the McMahon docu-series overall here. I mean, obviously, we both agree they could have done probably 30 episodes on this and just scratched the surface on everything else here. But Vince has reportedly wanted to buy the rights to this thing. They wanted to change it. They obviously weren't happy. They'd release a statement saying that, Vince was very disappointed with how much was left out here. Overall, if a non-wrestling fan crosses this thing, how thorough of a story do you think they're getting? And overall, what would you recommend people watch out of this if they only want to pick and choose?
Episodes 2 and 6 are probably were the most interesting to me, but I think to many people, episode 5 was the most interesting, which was the family dynamic. And that was a lot, new in the sense of, I'd heard some of the stories. The way the Vince-Shane relationship was portrayed, I mean, it's like I kind of knew it, but this went into way more detail of it. I thought that was, fascinating in many, many ways. I kind of, you kind of at the end feel very sorry for Shane. You really do. And I don't know that I ever felt sorry for Shane before, but I kind of do now.
All right, well, we'll talk about Shane McMahon in a different light coming up here, but Dave Meltzer, thank you for your thoughts on the Mr. McMahon documentary. Coming up next, more with Dave as we take a look at the weekend wrestling right here on McGuire on Wrestling. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for listening to McGuire on Wrestling. To be a part of the show, follow our social media or leave a tip. head to McGuireShow.com. This is McGuire on Wrestling. If you like McGuire on Wrestling, you need to subscribe to the free McGuire on Wrestling podcast feed. Not only do you get access to the show a day early, but you also get free bonus content every week. Share a laugh with Mitch and Dimitri on the alternate commentary table.
Oh, I'm Cody Brown. Look at me. Now, if this was Damian Priest, he'd apologize.
He probably would have apologized.
Follow along with the film career of one of wrestling's biggest stars with We've Seen a Movie.
Basically, I'm just watching John Cena play his wrestling character.
If John Cena was a raging alcoholic Atlantic City mooch before this.
Get all these shows, exclusive interviews, and more for free by subscribing to McGuire on Wrestling, wherever you get your podcasts. Welcome back to McGuire on Wrestling.
We are back with Dave Meltzer from the Wrestling Observer. And Dave, we just thoroughly did a deep dive here into the 6-part series of Mr. McMahon on Netflix. Thank you for that. And again, if people want to get your full thoughts on that, check out Dave's stuff at WrestlingObserver.com. I know you talked about it in depth on Wrestling Observer Radio. You've written a ton about it, and there's going to be a ton more, I'm sure, coming out about it as people continue to digest this thing. Let's talk about the last week in wrestling here. It was announced, first of all, by WWE that the first 2-day SummerSlam is coming up this year, and it'll be happening in New Jersey at MetLife Stadium. Clearly, New Jersey, the backing state on this one financially, since it is SummerSlam New Jersey, not SummerSlam New York, New Jersey, like they've done in the past.
Yeah. They're trying to bring in tourism. And, a big show like that's going to bring in tourism. Just part of what's being done in Endeavor. That's something that they're really good at. They've really monetized major UFC events all over the world. And now that's the next step is WWE. That's why there's, their mentality kind of is right now that they want the biggest shows in the United States, but they want lots of them outside the United States. Mm-hmm. So because they want to be able to get strong money all over the world for their live events, for their big live events.
Well, I think SummerSlam a better event choice for that MetLife Stadium area there. I mean, I went to WrestleMania 29 and it was cold, man. Like they had
at least for SummerSlam, it's not going to be, most likely won't be freezing. Yeah.
Do you think a 2-day SummerSlam is going to sustain the way a 2-day WrestleMania has? Do they have enough steam in the engine to keep these two tentpoles going for 2 days each?
It will become tradition, and yes, it will work in the long run. It is asking a lot. I mean, I could see 2 days once a year clearly works. For SummerSlam, it's going to be tougher. But I think in New York it'll do pretty well. And when it comes to tourists, it gives them one more big show. It actually is a positive. And there's a lot more money to be made with 2 shows than 1. So it's really not a negative. But yes, if you did it too many times a year, at some point you would burn out your audience. I think 2 a year is not that. But the second one's going to be, it won't be as easy as WrestleMania. WrestleMania, you snap your fingers, you announce WrestleMania in Las Vegas, and you're going to have, 50,000 tickets sold pretty quick. SummerSlam, 25, and then you got to get something from there. It's not as easy.
Some people were hypothesizing that this is just the beginning. And with an event like the Royal Rumble, where you have 2 Royal Rumble matches, that could be a 2-day event down the line as well. Do you think they roll the dice on this one and go for a third 2-day event?
I mean, it depends on how successful this is. If it's super successful, yes. If they struggle with it, no.
Fair enough there. I'm interested to see how things turn out for this thing. But speaking of WWE pay-per-views, Bad Blood is coming up a week from this weekend. And obviously, a pretty solid card here. A lot of the storylines building up to this show seem pretty strong, although a lot of storyline matches also being left off here. We talked about this before, about the pattern where WWE now seems to have main events and storylines that culminate on TV as well as on the PLEs here. And obviously the strategy seems to be working. I want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, they have so much depth, and they don't want to do, 4.5-hour shows every month. They like to cap it at just around 3, a little over 3. So, and they don't want to, with Vince, Vince would just screw with matches. You know what I mean? It's like, I'll put 9 matches on the show, and, you build something up for a month and you get a 4-minute match, right? And then Paul doesn't want to do that. If you're going to see a short match, it's either because there's a storyline reason for it to be short, or they don't think that the talent should have a long match. They're booking the matches to be the best the matches can be. If it's better to be short, it'll be short. If it's better to be long, it'll be long. With Vince, they are booking the matches to fit into a show. It's a completely different mentality. I think it makes for a much better show the way Paul does it, and you don't overdo it. You don't need, I think one of the things that they've proven, especially when it's, you're not paying $75 for the show. So to go in there and to get 5 or 6 matches in 3 hours, but it's all quality. You don't have bad matches. Rarely. I mean, obviously sometimes you're going to have them, but I think overall this is a better method. Before under Vince, again, Vince's mentality was different. Paul's more of a, I think, fan is probably the word, in the sense of he kind of has an idea of what he thinks him as a fan would want to see, which is good wrestling matches on the show, but not 4.5-hour shows, unless it's a WrestleMania, which is obviously different. And this is how he goes about doing it. And I think for the most part, it's been a success. I think it's been better than before.
He likes to let it breathe a bit, which is
So, I mean, one thing that I would say is negative on the Paul thing. There is too much time between matches. That's where I think AEW is superior in the sense that AEW there's not a lot of downtime. I mean, and it's not like an interview before the match is bad. That's fine. But I mean, we've seen the shows where it's like the second of the last match ends. And by the time the main event starts, you might have 40 minutes. And it's like, that's a waste of our time.
Oh, you've got promos, you've got commercials, you've got endorsements, you've got video packages. Yeah, it's definitely, I used to joke about this with UFC all the time because the time between bouts in UFC was always like, dear Lord, we got 20 minutes, 30 minutes between each fight, and then you got, maybe 10 minutes for the fight itself. And then you're done, and then you just move on. It's still working right now. Let's shift over to AEW now that you bring it up here. Obviously, they had their big Grand Slam show this past Wednesday. Overall, the Wednesday show I thought was pretty solid. Moxley now, the guy in the spot for the main event against Danielson at WrestleDream. Could Tacoma be Danielson's last match?
Yeah. It feels to me like it's too early. But again, Bryan's... we're in November. Bryan did promise, Birdie by the end of the year. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So we're coming close. So it could be, yeah, it could be. I don't know. I think at one point, I'm pretty sure at one point it was, and I don't know that that's changed. But it feels to me like, this feud between Bryan and Moxley. To me, it just feels like it should be more than one match. So that's why I think it shouldn't be finishing here. It probably should be 2-3 matches and then, finishing in December, or whatever. Well, it's November. So then you'd have the December. And that's only then. And so at best you're getting 2.
Well, Moxley's the guy. I mean, it's very apparent that Tony Khan holds him in high regard. A lot of people have said behind the scenes, Jon Moxley is considered the guy. There are fans that agree and disagree with that. But overall, I mean, he has been the guy in that company for the longest time now. It makes sense to me that this be his last match, if it is the last match, but we'll have to wait and see what. Plus, it's in Tacoma, it's in Washington State, so it's going to be tied close to Danielson's hometown, everything else. Yeah, I don't know what to expect on that one overall. We'll get back to AEW programming here in just a second. Have we heard anything, though, about the Lucha Brothers situation? There was a report that came out that was false that said they'd already signed a deal with WWE, and then...
Well, obviously they can't sign. They're still under contract. Penta's contract is up November. I'm not sure the date, but I know it's November. And Phoenix's contract is probably about 10 months longer. So, that's kind of your answer. I mean, I guess Tony could let them out early. I'm sure he's not going to let Penta out early. Penta's going, and Phoenix is probably going too. Almost, unless he changes his mind, he's going already. And then, but it's an interesting situation because, obviously there's clamor that, you should just let him go. And I think that in a different wrestling world, he would, but you can't be the pushover when the other guys in the same situation wouldn't. And they wouldn't. They how many guys, Brody Lee, FTR, getting stuff tacked on after the completion of their, what appeared to be their contract, and they wanted to leave and they just got it tacked on, and Brody Lee was the most egregious because, he wanted to go. His contract was up and they kept him for like another almost a year. And then right before it was going to be up and he could go, they went and fired him like a month before just to prove that they could fire him. That was like a horrible, just the whole thing. That was like, and that's who you're dealing with. You're in a war. You can't be the nice guy in the war, but we'll see. Right now, the last I heard is he was not going to let them go early. And it's like, a lot of people are mad, and I can get that. The only problem is that, and some people go, well, he's supposed to be the nice one. And it's like, well, you can't be the nice one in a war, but he's gone, and they're both gone. They were supposed to win the trios title at Wembley. And when that changed, it was kind of like, okay, that's Tony acknowledging that they're gone. I know Tony wanted to keep them. I know he made a great offer for them. I remember when I first kind of knew that Penta was very seriously wanting to leave and take Phoenix with him. And I mean, I asked Tony flat out, and he just goes, I'm going to keep him. I'm going to keep him. Don't, and I know he made the offer to keep him, but they just wanted to go. I think Penta more than Phoenix. I think Phoenix is just going to go where Penta goes.
All right, talking to Dave Meltzer from the Wrestling Observer and WrestlingObserver.com here on McGuire on Wrestling about AEW. We've talked about Bryan Danielson, and you mentioned how this match may be a little rushed, and if it was the last match for Danielson, how maybe there should be more here. This Wednesday, we are getting Ricochet versus Will Ospreay on TV for the International Championship. Talk about rushing matches here. This is obviously going to be a build-up to a series, most likely, but should this match be happening this soon?
It feels too early for me, but they've done a pretty good job the last week of pushing it. And they need something big. Look, they've got an anniversary show. They need something big for the anniversary show. So I guess what I would say is for the promotion, no. For the perfect timing of the match, yes. Yeah, it'd probably be better look, at worst, it was going to happen October 12th. So it's only 10 days early, so they'd once you start at the last pay-per-view, you shoot basically the deal at the pay-per-view. You never have the wait to do the match until, it's usually the next pay-per-view. So it's only 10 days early. So it's not, if I was doing it, I would probably avoid the match a little longer, but, once I tease it on the pay-per-view, that little longer would be October 12th.
Last thing for you, Dave, here. Swerve Strickland's been doing some media appearances. On one of them, he dropped that they were getting Fox as a future deal, that being AEW here. We've heard about the Shockwave trademark that's been filed for by AEW. The question now is, why are we still waiting on these announcements?
Well, for one, I don't believe that the Fox deal is done, and you can't make an announcement until a deal is done. And for WBD, I'm not sure what the whole deal is there, in the sense of, is it WBD that wants to time the announcement a certain time? Does AEW want to announce? I think that one of the things is if as it appears, Rampage will be over and done with, I think that AEW may want the announcement to be made at the time when they announce we don't have Rampage, but we're adding Shockwave, so you're getting more television, the same amount of television. It's not like something was canceled. We just moved a show to Fox, which is a different entity. Mm-hmm. But you can't do that until that deal is done. So that's, I think, what could be the holdup. So, the WBD deal is done, and I don't know what it completely entails. We're all waiting for that. But the other deal is not done. So maybe the idea is that he wants to announce both at the same time.
Dave Meltzer from the Wrestling Observer. Thank you as always, sir. Things we can read about in the latest edition of the newsletter?
Yeah, just giant story on Vince and the documentary. I go through what's true, what's not true. A lot of details on a lot of a lot more details on a lot of things that they covered that were not in there. So that's like the main big story. And, it's all the news, obviously, of the last week.
If you can answer this question in a minute, go ahead. If not, we'll talk about it next week. What was the biggest lie to come out of that special?
Vince's description of the fight with Bret Hart. Right? You know the story.
I know. Yeah, trust me. And when I saw Bret finally say it too, like he's never said it publicly, right? Where, I don't know where they came up with that story of Vince giving me one good shot, but
well, Vince saying that Richter refused to do the job, that had nothing to do with it at all. They wanted her to sign a contract. And she said, I want my lawyer to look at it. And then they stole the title from her that night, because in those days, they didn't like lawyers and agents. So you say lawyers and agents, and it's like, plus they were tired of her because MoW was bad-mouthing her really, really bad. But it wasn't about not doing the job. And with Bret, it really wasn't either, So yeah, if I have to say, but if you gotta give me one, I think the description of the fight's probably the one.
There you have it. Dave Meltzer, thank you as always, my friend. We'll talk to you again soon.
Okay. Have a great week.
Coming up next, it's our famous wrestling fan segment. International singing sensation Johnny Reid talks about his experience at the latest WrestleMania. That's on the way next.
These lines on my face tell the tales of 1,000 stories.
This is McGuire on Wrestling.
All the days gone by.
CKXU-FM 88.3 in Lethbridge is Southern Alberta's true alternative radio station.
The cream of the crop. Nobody does it better.
Proudly carrying McGuire on Wrestling every week.
Yeah.
If you're looking for something different to listen to,
This is gonna be a slobber knocker!
check out our NCRA award-winning lineup of programs or stream us anytime at ckxu.com.
Just getting started right here, right now. Just getting started, there's no slowing us down. When it comes to love, it feels like we're just getting started.
Welcome back to McGuire on Wrestling.
Welcome back to the show. Well, every once in a while, we like to do a segment here called Famous Wrestling Fans. This is a guy who, I don't know, 15 years ago surprised me by saying that he was actually getting into watching WWE, and it was all because his kids were getting into it. There is a famous interview out there somewhere on YouTube by myself and Johnny Reid making WrestleMania picks back in the day. But Johnny, so great to have you here, man. Thanks for being on the show.
Good to be here, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Well, this is unreal. We were doing a promo talking about your upcoming Christmas tour, which is going to be going across Canada. So if people are listening from anywhere, check out Johnny Reid's Christmas tour because it will be coming to a town near you. But Johnny, for those that don't know, I mean, let's face it, you're Mr. Christmas. You're our kind of one of our hard to put in a box singers. You're Johnny Reid. I mean, you're a very adult, friendly, family, fun show. And one day you and I are talking, and you're like, yeah, I'm getting all into wrestling. And I was like, really? So, I mean, here we are all these years later, and you're still a fan. Are you more of a fan now?
Well, I have to say, Mike, I growing up where I grew up in Scotland, we had wrestling there. We had British wrestling. There was guys like Giant Haystacks and Big Daddy and these kind of guys. And I always enjoyed watching the wrestling growing up, but I never ever watched it until I watched Rocky. And it was the very first place that I saw Thunder Lips, who was played by Hulk Hogan.
Yes, sir.
And it kind of got me interested. I was like, well, what's this? Professional wrestling. So paid a wee bit of attention to it. Moved to Canada. Rowdy Roddy, the Ultimate Warrior. Ric Flair. All these Macho Man Savage and stuff. But I never ever went to see it. I would just kind of watch it on the telly and stuff. And then I had children. And my boys, who are now, Justin's 23, Tyler's 21, Dylan's 18, and Ava, she's 15, and they all love the wrestling. And they've always loved it. Jen's, my wife's brother, had all these figurines from back in the day. So my boys grew up around all these wee wrestling toys, and they loved wrestling. So because of that, it just, it just kind of reignited this interest in wrestling. And to this day, we love it. We still get together, whenever everybody's home. We're watching Monday Night Raw, we're watching SmackDown. And as I mentioned to you, this past WrestleMania in Philadelphia, I loaded all the kids up and we flew to Philly.
Wow.
And we took in WrestleMania.
Okay, you're known for your fancy jackets and your great onstage wardrobe. At certain WWE events, they are now selling replica Cody Rhodes robes. Is there a chance we might see Johnny Reid in one of those one day?
Yeah, I think I'm too short to wear a robe. I think it might be dragging like a set of curtains behind me. But I have to tell you, I love the showmanship of the WWE and professional wrestling. I think that's part of the big draw for me, is just how much attention to detail, whether it be the tribal chief, whether it be, Cody Rhodes is a great example, even the Miz, man. But I love watching his outfits and how he presents, himself. I've just become a big fan of the whole business and how it works and how it brings people together. I mean, Mike, I was in Philadelphia. I've been to, as you know, a lot of big events.
Yeah.
I have never in my life seen so many people be brought together in such a way. It was incredible. And I went to WrestleMania thinking that I was going to see a bunch of kids. I was like, I'm just going to go and it's just going to be a bunch of kids and stuff. No, it's such an array of people, culture. It denies culture, color, creed, religion. It's just a bunch of really hardworking people that are just out there enjoying entertainment, and these guys that are in the ring, these men and women are in there. I mean, they're unbelievable. I mean, just a next level of athleticism. It's crazy.
Well, they are going to be in Vancouver about the same time you're touring across Canada with your tour. I don't know if you can get that day off or not, but I mean, when it comes down to it, it sounds like something you get to take your family to and enjoy. I guess the big question I have is that what at this age still keeps you interested? Is it something that you just get to experience with your family still? Yeah,
it's really the kids. They talk about wealth, right? We talk about wealth and we talk about what it means to be wealthy, and wealth to me is the minutes that I get to spend with the kids, man. And you can buy a kid a fishing rod, right? But when you take a kid fishing, that's so much more valuable, right? So like for me, being able to enjoy that experience with my kids was amazing. To be able to walk into the stadium, to be able to soak up that atmosphere, to be able to take them to these fan events before the show, you know what I mean? Checking into the hotel, we're checking into the hotel and R-Truth walks up to my kids and gives them a high five, right? I need to send you. I'm going to send you a bunch of pictures, Mike. I'll text you a bunch of pictures for that. Yeah, and it was amazing. We just totally by chance, we were in the same hotel as all the WWE stars, superstars. So we were sitting in the lobby having breakfast, and everybody's walking around, and the kids were just blown away. I mean, they just couldn't believe how fortunate they were to be this close to a lot of the people that they've been watching on TV for years,
We've only got a minute left here, but talking to famous wrestling fan, a good friend, Johnny Reid. Thanks for making the time for us wrestling fans here on McGuire on Wrestling. Last question. Who do you think is going to be John Cena's final opponent when he wraps it all up next year?
Woo, good question, man. I would love to have said Stone Cold. That would have been awesome. I just don't know if that's even in the cards. Don't know, man. Be honest. What do you think?
Oh, I don't know, man. I would like to see it be somebody legacy, but I don't know. Yeah. I don't know. I think
we'll see, man. I mean, as long as he goes out on top, we're gonna be good.
I think it should be the man that's looked up to him since childhood, R-Truth. I think that's who it should be.
Would that not be crazy? That would be amazing.
Johnny Reid, thank you, sir.
Thanks, Mike.
McGuire on Wrestling.
What did I tell you? You just never know what you're going to get on this show, but I guarantee you're going to get our very best each and every week. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you enjoyed the in-depth talk. I think we covered both sides of the spectrum, right? Like the whole Mr. McMahon thing, kind of makes you feel crummy about being a wrestling fan. But then guys like Johnny Reid, I mean, you heard it in his voice. This guy's got a lot going on, really good in his life. And one of those things is getting to take his kids to wrestling. That is the whole point of this. We celebrate pro wrestling. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you're listening to the radio version, there's actually a whole lot more show waiting for you this week. The extended edition you can hear in podcast form at McGuireShow.com or download McGuire on Wrestling wherever you get your podcast. But that's it. We got to go. Until next time, as always, thank you for listening. And let me do what I do. Gonna leave you with some of Johnny's new single. It's called Just Getting Started. Until next time, play safe, drive safe. Be seeing ya.
McGuire on Wrestling. Online and on the radio. Listen to the show Mondays at 4 p.m. Mountain Time at ckxu.com, wherever you get your podcasts, and at McGuireShow.com.
These lines on my face tell the tales of 1,000 stories. All the days gone by, now